It's very, very simple. I give you a few guidelines and you're going to have no problem doing composting.
We've got 7 or 8 piles in front of us here.
Do you see on either end,
Yeah.
you have the very brown and you have the very green.
Yeah.
So the lawn mowings in the middle, of course, is the neutral crop.
Yeah.
And it's all to do with the carbon to nitrogen ratio.
Okay.
So that one in the middle is the neutral one. And the further away you go from the middle, the more extreme they become.
Okay.
If you only have green materials,
Yeah.
what happens is, your instance, your compost gets sludgy,
Yeah.
wet and smelly. And the smell, of course, is a form of nitrogen. It's ammoniac.
Okay.
And if it leaches out, it's a form of nitrate. It's nitrate, another form of nitrogen.
So too much nitrogen gives
Is
you a sludgy.
Sludgy, smelly, wet compost with flies often.
Right.
And that's mostly if you have lawn mowings and kitchen waste only.
Okay.
If you have a brown compost, a lot of gardener would have lots of herbaceous cuttings. A brown compost just takes ages to decompose.
Because there's very little nitrogen.
There's very little nitrogen in it.
Okay.
Exactly. All we need to do is mix the two in layers in your compost heap.
Okay.
But we might go through each of the ingredients.
Yeah, so I mean, grass cuttings, people produce loads of them in the summer. So these are a good ingredient.
You could
for your
nearly
compost
feed your vegetable garden with your lawn mowings.
heap. Right.
And unfortunately, they're all nearly always dumped because it's a difficult material to
Yeah.
compost well.
Yeah.
So on its own, complete disaster.
Okay.
But
so it needs to be mixed with
say,
something brown.
leaves would be fantastic that you've collected the previous autumn,
Yeah.
or newspapers, torn, shredded newspapers,
Okay.
thin layers of each.
If you only used grass cuttings and newspapers, you'd have very good compost.
Yeah,
So
it
that-
would
that
work if you
fits
have the
in with what
ratio
you're
well.
saying. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. We move on then. We've got, looks like vegetable cuttings from the kitchen.
So ideally, you should only use uncooked
Yeah.
vegetable
Otherwise,
waste.
you'd attract.
The only reason is that you may attract vermin.
Yeah.
If you have a vermin-free compost container with netting underneath, you can use
Yeah.
cooked food waste. Also green material, and it tends to be very wet, so it really
Yeah.
needs to be balanced with the brown material. Straw would be good, but any others would be good as well.
So then we have, these are weeds. Now I would have always thought, don't put weeds in your compost heap because they'll propagate and you'll end up with a weedy compost
Yeah.
heap, but that's not necessarily the
No,
case.
my compost heap would be mostly weeds. So some weeds like bindweed, ground elder,
Yeah, the very aggressive
Scotch
weeds.
grass, yeah, you might keep them out.
Okay,
of
so
the
kind
compost.
of annual weeds.
The annual weeds, and before they flower, ideally.
Before they flower, because once they flower,
the
their
seeds might survive in
Okay.
the composting process.
Okay, and as we get closer to the centre now, we're into long grass. Looks like
Long grass or hay,
Or hay,
nearly,
yeah.
isn't it? Just to illustrate, that's the neutral material. If you make a compost out of that, it'll break down on its own.
On its
You
own.
don't need to layer it, you don't need to balance it. See, here we have the grass, isn't it? Very high in nitrogen.
Yeah.
But as it grows, it gets harder, and the harder bit is the carbon.
Okay.
So it has the right ratio, and it makes a good compost on its own.
Okay.
Later on, when it gets brown, it goes more into the brown side, obviously,
Right,
when the
okay.
colour goes.
Okay, then we move on. We've got
Rushes and
Rushes.
reeds, yeah. They're very good for the compost. You might have to watch the seeds, though. Otherwise, you might have lots of rushes growing in
Yeah.
your garden.
okay.
You don't want that either.
Can
Ideally,
they just go on like that, or
no,
should
you'd chop them
we chop them up okay.
before they go in.
Okay, then we move on to straw, which I suppose that not a lot of people would have access to, but some,
You don't, but you often can get a straw bale, and
Yeah.
it's quite handy and neat. And one straw bale would last you a long time in your compost.
yeah,
container.
just to have it there to add to compost.
Yeah, because most of your ingredients will be green, isn't it? Your lawn mowings and
Yeah.
kitchen waste. So
Yeah.
you want something like
This is
that
a good
handy.
balancing ingredient.
And look, it's
yeah.
hollow inside, so it has
Yes.
aeration that'll actually bring air into the heap.
Okay, okay.
Fantastic.
We move on to, this looks like something that people would have a lot of, egg cartons, brown paper, newspapers.
Absolutely great, yeah.
And so on.
The only thing I would avoid is the glossy magazines because
Okay.
of the heavy metal content in the
So-
ink.
so-
And the smaller the better, of
Yeah.
course, if you shred them or tear them. It's
Okay.
small. Worms seem to like that
Yeah.
a lot, yeah.
Okay. And then the final little heap there is
Wood
is
chippings.
Wood chippings
Yeah,
or
yeah.
sawdust.
I
suppose,
only put that there for illustrating the brown materials.
Right.
That's far on the end of the scale of
Okay.
of
So
it.
it'll take a
That-
long time to break down.
Yeah, or a lot of green materials to break it down. And it's a dangerous one to use because if you have too much of it in, it'll rob the nitrogen from your compost.
Okay,
So I just put that in.
Avoid it.
Best to avoid it.
Yeah. I suppose the next step or the next question is where do we do this? You know, people see lots of different options. We've a few examples
there's
behind
different compost containers. That's a very handy one. I like the wooden ones more than the plastic ones. These are better because you have air coming in from the side. Do you see that? It's a good design. Here, you have to make a better compost in there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to make sure that nature can't sort that. If you go wrong there, it'll become a mess. Whereas here, you get air coming in.
Okay.
So you have to be more careful and balance the green and brown better.
Yeah. Do you build up your layers and then stop adding to it and then leave it alone for 6 months, or do you can you keep adding and then take the stuff from underneath? That's what sort of often comes.
Well, ideally you'd get a second container.
Right.
So you fill this container when it's full, when you can't put any more in, then I would nearly be inclined to turn that into the second one.
Okay.
Because that's the other good and golden rule of composting. The more often you turn it or activate your compost, the faster it composes, decomposes, because you bring air into the whole layer and you expose the material that was below, above.
Okay.
It really speeds it up.
So again, that's kind of counterintuitive, because you might think if you leave it alone, it generates heat, it'll rot quicker, but actually the opposite is...
No, a compost does generate heat, and that's very interesting. If you pile that up in one day, it'll heat up within 2 to 3 days to a temperature of over 60 degrees. You would burn your hands if you do it well. And then the temperature curve goes up and then slowly down. Mm-hmm. When you turn it again, at that stage, it'll heat up again because you've injected air into it.
Yeah. So would we cover it with carpet or?
Yeah, anything, a carpet or a piece of timber or.
Yeah. Not plastic.
Black plastic, anything.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Klaus, if there were 3 golden rules to avoid the great sludge heap, what would they be?
Well, as we said earlier, the right ingredients.
Yeah.
Alternate green and brown materials, 5 centimeters in depth. Very simple. The other one, the smaller the ingredients, the faster it breaks down.
Okay.
So if you chew your food properly, your digestion is easier.
Okay.
A cabbage trunk, for example, would take 2 or 3 years to break down.
Okay.
If you chop it, 6 months. If you shred it, 6 weeks.
Okay, so small materials.
The smaller, the better. And the third one is turn your heap.
Yeah, to get the
The more often you turn it, the faster it goes.
Okay.
And that's only if you're impatient, though.
Okay.
But you could turn. I usually turn my compost twice.
In a 6 month period, or whatever.
Yeah, and then it's ready within 4 months nearly.
Okay. And Klaus, hopefully then the end result is this, something I've only ever seen in books, I think, but this is your homemade compost.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, isn't it? And
Beautiful.
It smells delicious.
Lovely
Then you
sweet
actually
bread.
know that it's ready, when there's no smell, no awful smell to it anymore.
Maybe next year, eh?
Oh, absolutely, you will. You've no excuse
Never
anymore
mind,
now,
I had
haven't
to
you?
do it.